Hello, my name is Analise Perez, and my group is going to be doing GMOs, or genetically modified organisms. So I'm going to be doing the history. So humans have been genetically modifying different organisms for as far back as 30,000 years by selective breeding and artificial selection. The first organism that was thought to be that is thought to be selectively bred was the dog. That's why there's different types of dogs for different jobs. The earliest plant is thought to be wheat, and corn has been the most prevalent change in a plant by genetic engineering. So I have a timeline here for genetic engineering, and so in 1973, Boyer and Cohen developed genetic engineering. They took one gene out of one organism and put it into another. In 1975, at the Asilomar Conference, rules and guidelines were set by government officials and other scientists for genetic engineering experiments. And then in 1980, the U.S. Supreme Court actually ruled that companies and scientists can patent genetically engineered organisms. And then in 1982, the FDA approved Humulin, which is the first pharmaceutical manufactured using GE technology. And then in 1992, Flavor Saver tomatoes were the first genetically engineered crop approved by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. In these tomatoes, the shelf life was longer. And then in 1995, the U.S. approved insecticide-producing crops. And then in 1996, herbicide-resistant crops were first introduced, and herbicide-resistant crops make the lives of farmers easier. Thank you.
There are a lot of controversies involving genetically modified organisms. However, these controversies are more public fear than actual science. The more controversial ones involve crops and produce. One of the major controversies is cross-contamination. This is when a GMO comes in contact with a non-GMO crop. This brings unwanted characteristics, such as the crop or plant being sterile. This can happen in a couple of different ways. A more natural way involves the wind. There are buffers in place to prevent this from happening, but they have found GMO crops growing when they have not been planted. Another more natural way is when runoff water brings the two crops in contact with each other, which brings these unwanted characteristics. Another more mechanical way is when a farmer hires a harvester to plow his land and harvest the produce, then does not properly clean his equipment, which then brings these particles to a non-GMO harvest, which then contaminates the harvest. Another controversial topic is labeling. GMO farmers are not required to label their produce as GMO. It is statistically proven that people would rather choose to have their produce as non-GMO produce. Another more concerning topic was pesticides. These genetically modified organisms are being modified to prevent insects. They are being somewhat putting poison inside of them that will kill the insects, and people are afraid because you cannot just simply wash these pesticides off. They are embedded in part of the produce or vegetables.
It takes many years to bring new technology to the market, according to the history of genetically modified organisms. However, recently in Canada, a rarely forward was made for genetically modified foods when consumers gained access to a genetically modified salmon. This is the first genetically modified animal to reach the market nearly 2 decades after the commercialization of genetically modified plants. Not only can this approval bring both business and environmental benefits, but also help pave the way for other genetically modified animals. For example, scientists are working on disease-resistant pigs, bird flu-resistant chickens, hornless dairy cows, and highly productive sheep. Another issue is an increase in the resistance challenge we are facing from both weeds and insects that must be improved in the upcoming years. Due to the widespread planting of insect-resistant crops is causing the pests to become resistant to the new technology, leaving crops once again vulnerable for attack. Scientists have begun a new technological battle with pests by developing new genes to create crops that are not resistant to insects.
Okay, so there are many different kinds of genetically modified foods, many of which you can easily find in your refrigerator or in your pantry. Some examples are corn, soybeans, milk, canola oil, and potatoes. One study showed that milk actually contains a hormone that could contain high risk factors for different kinds of cancers, which is very bad, which is why certain countries like Benin, Serbia, Zambia have banned all imports and cultivation of GMOs, and also Brazil. Brazil is one of the more recent ones. But that being said, there are more than 75 different countries who do support import GMOs, like the United States, for example, Canada, South Africa, Australia, and many more very popular countries. And that is because there's many benefits, like genetically modified foods are resistant to herbicides and insects, and others resist climate, like the climate change, because the climate is changing very drastically, so you need to be able to make up for that some way so that the food can continue to grow and thrive. And also the fact that our population is growing, so you need to be able to produce more food, which is something that genetically modified foods has to offer. And also traditional farming is much harder to do than it was before. Also because the population is growing, and so you need more land than you used to, and gaining that amount of land is very costly and competitive. And you also need to take into consideration the fact that you need to be able to you need to have land that is going to be fit for the crops that you're trying to grow. And also, if you have a traditional farm and GMO seed happens to drift into your crop, they can sue you a lot of money for their seed being in your crop, which is not good at all. That can be very costly. It can cost them their farm. That being said, there's also a lot of risk factors for genetically modified crops, like the fact that we don't know what effect it has on our health, just because there's lack of long-term studies on it, and it's also caused the emergence of superweeds and superbugs, which are resistant to our herbicides now, so it's very hard to kill them. And now 64 countries require you to label your genetically modified foods on packaging, while the United States, Canada, and Mexico don't. They have no laws requiring you to label your foods. Except for the United States, they recently passed a law called the DARK Act that says by 2022 you have to label all of your foods. Not all, some, but not all of your foods by 2022.